On this world, I have lived in one area for a very long time. To be more specific, I've lived here for almost a decade. I do have a few satellite bases, such as a nether base and a couple of other small outlet builds for various functions, but the vast majority of stuff is within this one claim. Because of this, some sections are more compact and more important than others. As a general rule of thumb, the third of my base which is closest to land, I am in a lot more and is much more compact than the other 2/3 of my base. However, in that section, you might notice that there is an island right here. And despite it being relatively new, it certainly keeps with the theme of compactness. And despite that, surprisingly has a long history, far predating before the actual construction set starts. This is the history of my evil island, my most important and compact island practically ever. By the way, I cannot believe I'm saying this, but thank you all so much for 1,000 subscribers. It literally has been less than a month since I hit 100 subs. This is actually ridiculous. Granted, I know the paid promotions I was doing for a while was helping a lot with that, but still, this growth is completely unprecedented, and I'm so glad you guys are all liking these videos. So if you do, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to my channel, comment down below, and let's get to 2,000 subs by the end of the year. You can make a difference. So, why is this island extremely important? Well, despite its unimpressive size, it managed to contain farms for wheat, carrots, potatoes, pumpkins, wool, eggs, honey, and honeycombs. Not only that, but it also contains an enchanting table with all of the necessities, all of my villagers, and lots of storage for all of the resources I get from it, alongside lots of storage for the farms. Because of this, I spend a good chunk of time on this island, even now after the island has been up for over 2 years. So now that we've got that out of the way, how did this island begin and how did it evolve to how we see it today? This story all started in early 2019. At the time, the SMP Hermitcraft was starting to gain a lot of attention, which is one that you probably know of nowadays, and I was one of the earlier people to start watching. Now this is roughly around the same time that season 6 started, and in this season, Mumbo Jumbo had an island that had his villagers a lot of useful farms, which he dubbed his evil island. Usually I try not to get ideas from other creators, instead I try to innovate them and create my own ones. But this idea I just felt like I had to incorporate on this world just because I liked it so much. At the time, however, I wanted it to be way bigger than the final version would end up being, so I would need to think outside of the box. Because of that, none of the islands near my base were sufficient. This is part of the reason why I was encouraged to attempt to make a new base far away from spawn. The Evil Island project would most likely come after a main mega base was completed. However, this would end up in failure, as not only would it never be completed, but I would never even build a mega base in the first place, and I would return back to my original base, and I took a long break. When I returned in 2023, I first did not anticipate adding one to my base. At the time, I wasn't exactly sure of the shape of the base and if I'd even have a border wall in the first place. However, as the months went on, I got a clearer idea of how the base would end up, and alongside some terraforming around the area, I noticed an opportunity for this one dead idea to be revived. This island, directly south of my base, is now inhabited by someone else. However, at the time, I wanted to, in a rare moment, expand my claim there. In December 2023, I sent a claim request. I was not exactly sure if the admins wanted someone else to be there, or if it was to be a no man's land, or if they were perfectly okay with me claiming it. However, I would get a message back from them a couple days later saying that they made up their decision and they wanted someone else to be there. Even though this was a defeat in the short term, it wasn't that big of one, as I could keep the island within the bounds of my old claim. Almost immediately after that, I noticed the D shape of my base. And part of my base being in a shape like this is that there are 2 spots where I could fit an island. One in the front and one in the back. I was only thinking about having one island, and little did I know that this decision would probably be one of the biggest dilemmas I'd ever had in Minecraft. As I thought about it more and more, there are more reasons to put it in front, and likewise, there were more reasons to put it in the back. It was a cycle which was basically never ending. Here's a quick list as to some of the advantages of putting it in the front versus putting it in the back. I'll start from the front. First off, the water was shallower. It was closer to where I usually was. It was easier to travel by boat, closer to other islands. Gives my base more shape due to the canal. Could be used as an extended dock. It was right next to my mob farm, creating a tall subsection of the base. The back section was better for an underwater base. It was closer to my more essential stuff, and it was also closer to 0-0. While some of the advantages from building it in the back included being closer to more recent builds, the area is larger, it doesn't block the view of my turtle sanctuary, could promote more settling to the far side of my base, transporting by boat is smoother, it was closer to my brother's base if he ever returned, and there were more farms which were on that side. And alongside of that, there are also probably a dozen other reasons for wanting to put on either side that I just forgot while writing this script. Now, it's pretty obvious that by looking at a map, or from angle practically, that I ended up finally choosing the front of my base. But why? I tried to go through the points one by one. A lot of the points on both sides didn't really matter, they were just very small. But the ones which mattered the most, there was barely a majority that favored putting in the front. One important factor was that I put a decoy frame for both islands on both sides to see how it would look on either end. What I noticed is that the island on the back, even though that section was technically bigger, it really was only longer, and it wasn't any wider due to the increased depth of the ocean floor. And that would probably cause more issues than not, as the buildings would be more spread out and it would probably look worse. I also found out that you could go through the island if it was in the front, but you might need to wiggle a little bit in some sections. It didn't delay very much time, however, and it was still way quicker to go through in between the island and the base than around it. The shallower water, I also mentioned this a bit, it also made it so that I would need less space to build upwards with the slope of the island, essentially saving space. Now that I got a location, how would the island look like? Well, the plan would have to be constrained a little bit due to the awkward shape, but the general plan still stayed the same. The entire island would be in a uniform color palette, with the island being a sandy, beachy island, and the structures matching the same palette as the perimeter of my base. There are going to be 3 towers, 2 on each end and 1 at the corner at the back, which bends. There would be a tiny plaza / walkway between these buildings. In this plaza, there will be a bubble which takes you down to 3 floors. The big thing about the island is that all of the villagers will be inside of it. However, there will also be related farms to them as well. None of the buildings will be accessible, as all of them would contain the farms, with each one consisting of a different farm. One would have a giant melon and pumpkin farm, one would have passive mobs such as sheep, bees, and chickens, and one would be a crop farm, with all the crops, obviously except for beetroots. If the towers above ground were inaccessible, then you probably assume that everywhere accessible would be underneath the island, connected with the bubble. And you would be correct. The first floor would have the storage for all of the farms, while the second and third floor would have the villagers. The third floor would have all of the books, while the second floor would have all of the other trades. However, almost instantly, I ran into problems. First off, due to lag issue, there was both a mob cap and a hopper cap. The hopper cap would become a problem later, but the more imminent problem was the villager cap in particular. I could have only 15 villagers, so I had to be extremely careful as to which profession each villager would be. Another problem was that the first floor underground in particular was an extremely awkward shape, and it couldn't be used for storage or for holding villagers. You see, the second and third floor were large enough that they had the shape where there was this relatively large main room with a tail which goes back and behind the bubble, but the island wasn't large enough on the first floor for his pattern to work, so I had to be more innovative. The idea that I came up with was that the first floor would most likely be something even smaller than the room that I had, although I would have pipelines which would go to the storage areas for the rest of it. Also, alongside of that, the storage room, rather than on the first floor, would now be on the third floor. All villagers except for 3, which would be the ones running the crop farms, would be on the second floor. Also, I'll have only 3 villagers running the crop farms, so I have 12 that I can play around with trades. I also added a room for converting zombie villagers on the second floor as well, although nowadays it looks more like a jail cell than anything else. This would bring up one question though. What would be inside of that main room of the first floor? What would even be small enough to fit inside of it? I did some thinking and I got an answer. This was something that would help with the limited number of villagers, and also something I needed an upgraded version of for so long. And I also hinted at it last episode. A new enchanting setup. This new setup would not only be much prettier, which was probably a necessity at this point so I wouldn't lose my vision by the age of 25. But it would also have everything I need neatly organized, such as lapis, anvils, and a grindstone. There will also be a bed in this room, not only to balance the asymmetry out, but also so that if people needed to sleep and I was working in the area, it would be easier for me to sleep. It's also brought up a new question. Since I can only have 12 villagers, what professions and trades would they be? And this made me think about a challenge that would be very fitting with this world. Not only would every villager be cured, but essentially I wanted to try to get as many good book trades on as few librarians as possible, so I could have more villagers of other professions. Ideally, I wanted to have 6 or less by librarians, so that the rest could obviously be other villagers. Alongside that, I wanted to have all the smiths so I could give away villager tools and armor. I could omit the weaponsmith if I wanted to, but I'd like to have the toolsmith and armorer. I'd also like 2 farmers, with both of them having the pumpkin trade so I can trade all of my crops, alongside having at least one of them have the apple trade and maybe one have the bread trade if I needed that. A butcher or 2 would also be nice for stocking the community chests because their trades are just so ridiculously cheap, it's not even funny. A fletcher might be nice for tipped arrows, and a cleric might also be nice for bottles of enchanting and resources such as redstone and lapis. The other professions, such as shepherds, leatherworkers, cartographers, and fishermen, were a low priority, although they could work if I had space. Masons wasn't really in my mind, as you kind of need a lot of them in order for them to be viable, unless you wanted like the andesite or diorite or granite trade, which I wasn't really looking for. So I decided to just play by ear, and I'll eventually figure something out. So I started getting zombie villagers. Originally, I got them from outside, but I then looked to use a plugin on the server where I could buy spawn eggs with job credits and use them on spawners. Granted, it wasn't the most vanilla thing, and it was a bit cheap. However, due to the lag constraints, villager breeders were hard to make, so it felt fair enough. I first solely focused on the librarians. The books I wanted were Sharpness 5, Efficiency 5, Protection 4, Thorns 3, Unbreaking 3, Mending, Looting 3, Sweeping Edge 3, and Infinity. I also wanted 2 mending trades so I could donate them to the chests quicker. And yeah, I started cycling. The problem about this is that the only book I could choose is from the first trade, so getting 2 of them on the same villager was basically down to RNG. There are some strategies to use, such as trying to get the books such as Mending with only 1 level as one of the other trades, as they would be more likely to show up than a trade like with 5 levels like Efficiency. Also, they would be more likely to cost 1 emerald, which was also nice. I was also fine with a few of the books being a tier under, as long as I could just combine them, and it wouldn't make that big of a difference. Now, this process started when I was on winter break from college in the holidays season between 2023 and 2024, and it took the entire break cycling all of these villagers. I am not even joking. I'd spend multiple hours a day cycling villagers just so that I could get the right ones. Although, just as the break was going to end, a light appeared at the end of the tunnel, as I somehow accidentally got it with only 5 librarians instead of 6, with each one having at least 2 of the trades listed above. Now, this gave me 7 other villagers that I could work with, and that I could put into any combination I wanted. I first played a bit conservative, and I got 1 farmer and all of the smiths except for a weaponsmith. The rest I just play around with. First, I was playing around with a Fletcher. I wanted to get something like weakness or instant damage arrows, just because those might be fun to use and they're really hard to get. And I actually was able to get instant damage on one of them. It also had some nice trades, such as trading sticks, having extremely cheap arrows, and also I just like the fact that I don't need a tripwire hook to craft a crossbow anymore if I needed to. I then played around with several combinations with all sorts of professions, including clerics, shepherds, and fishermen. But I eventually settled on, alongside with the 5 librarians, a Fletcher, a toolsmith, a weaponsmith, an armorer, 2 farmers with all 3 crop trades and the bread trade, alongside 1 with pumpkin pie and 1 with apples, and 1 butcher with both cooked meat trades. I also added a couple of shops with extremely cheap deals to encourage people to settle near me. However, this never really worked. And the evil island was done. Mostly done. The reality was that out of the 3 towers, the exteriors were all built, but only the crop tower was functional. The other 2 wouldn't be finished until 5 months later. Yeah, I took my sweet time with them. Not only that, but the processing area around the enchanting table was so compact that you literally could not move around in it. And this didn't really help. I had to use skipping hoppers and water streams due to the hopper constraints. Yeah, this was definitely by far my most compact build ever, and that was exactly part of the challenge. However, this would inadvertently make it nearly impossible to debug, as a cat and mouse game started that if one system stops working and I fix it, I break another one in the process, and then that cycle would just continue. This cycle continued for years after an island was done, with the farms being broken always changing, until I finally got to work in early 2026. From that point on until now, not many developments have happened in particular, but there were a few adjustments that I did make. First off, I was able to optimize the system when it came to hoppers more, so I could just generally have more around my base while not producing as much lag. Second, I replaced some of the cyan terracotta with the new tough bricks and polished variants on passive mob tower in particular. Third, I switched out the chicken farm back to an egg farm, as the mob cap made it extremely inefficient. I also made a slight adjustment to my enchanting table, which I did mention in a previous video, also in 2026, but it was just more aesthetic than anything else. Also, by the way, I did push it out one block, and if you were wondering how long it took to do so, all I'm gonna say is that it took a very long time, as I had to reroute dozens of pipes. I did actually manage to get extremely lucky, however, I somehow, by a miracle of God, managed to not break a single one. Yeah, I don't know how that happened, to be honest. And yeah, that brings it to today, where this island is still really functional and is an area where I get a lot of the resources I have. This island definitely, even though it was a really big project, it definitely was worthwhile in the end. And also, I'm happy to say that it definitely did help in a lot of regards, such as with food, also donating, having a book supply, a whole bunch of different ways. And yeah, that is the history of my most important island on my Minecraft Forever world. And I hope you enjoyed going on this ride with me as much as I enjoyed making this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. And of course, if you don't like the video, make sure to dislike as well. Don't feel pressured not to. Any rating helps. And I'll see you guys all in the next video. Peace out!